It's 9:47 on a Thursday evening. The dishes are done. The phone hasn't buzzed in over an hour.
The garage light is still on because you were fixing something that didn't really need fixing. Not because it was broken, but because your hands have always understood problems better than your words ever did.
The house is quiet. Not the lonely kind of quiet. The familiar kind. The kind that lets you hear yourself think.
You sit down with a cup of coffee that's gone slightly cold. The television is playing in the background, but you're not watching it. Your mind drifts somewhere else, to an old job, an old friend, an old truck you wish you'd never sold. Maybe that's you. Or maybe you've known a man exactly like this. He isn't chasing attention. He isn't trying to prove anything. He's simply settled. Not because life was easy. Because somewhere along the way, he learned a rule that few people ever said out loud. A rule that shaped an entire generation of men. A rule so ordinary that most of them don't even realize they're still living by it. And strangely enough, it may be the very reason so many Gen X men became exceptionally resilient. Not stronger, not tougher. Resilient. There's a difference. Strength is about resisting pressure. Resilience is about absorbing it and continuing anyway. For decades, people have tried to explain the men of Generation X. Some call them detached. Others say they're cynical, independent, emotionally unavailable, hard to read. But those descriptions often miss something important. Because if you spend enough time listening instead of judging, another picture begins to emerge. These men weren't shaped by speeches. They were shaped by repetition, by responsibility, by disappointments no one applauded, by mornings when the alarm clock rang whether they felt ready or not, by afternoons spent figuring things out because no one else was coming, and by evenings, much like this one. Quiet, ordinary, forgettable to everyone else, yet quietly building something that couldn't be seen. Character.
People often assume resilience is built during dramatic moments. Military service, major loss, financial collapse. Sometimes that's true. But more often, resilience grows in smaller moments. The sink that leaks, the overtime shift, the promise you keep even after you've stopped feeling motivated, the child watching you more closely than you realize, the marriage that requires a...
Generation X didn't invent these experiences, but they lived through them during a time that expected something very specific from men. Handle it. Figure it out. Keep going. No ceremony. No audience. No applause. At first glance, that sounds harsh. And in many ways, it was. But here's where it gets complicated. Because hidden inside that demanding expectation was a psychological habit that modern culture rarely talks about. The habit of separating identity from emotion. Not ignoring emotion. Not denying it. Simply refusing to let every feeling become a command. That distinction changes everything. Think about the men you admire most. Not the loudest men. Not the richest, not the most charismatic, the dependable ones, the ones who arrive early, who fix what they can, who rarely make promises they don't intend to keep, who become calmer when everyone else becomes louder. Those men often share something invisible. They don't organize their lives around how they feel today. They organize them around who they decided to be years ago. And that quiet rule has enormous psychological consequences. Because every time a man acts according to his values instead of his temporary emotions, something subtle happens. He begins trusting himself. Not because life becomes easier, because his own behavior becomes predictable, reliable,
solid. Like an old oak tree that has survived so many storms, it no longer panics when the wind begins to rise. You've probably seen this in your own life without realizing it. There were mornings you didn't feel capable, days you doubted yourself. Moments when walking away would have been understandable, but you stayed. Not because you were fearless, because somewhere inside you, another voice spoke more quietly than fear ever could. It simply said, "Do what needs to be done." No slogans, no grand philosophy. Just 6 ordinary words. And over the years, those 6 words became something far greater than a habit. They became an identity. That identity didn't arrive all at once. It was built one ordinary day at a time. One repair, one paycheck, one difficult conversation, one disappointment that didn't become an excuse. Looking back, it's almost impossible to point to the exact moment it happened. There wasn't a ceremony. No one handed out certificates for becoming dependable. No one announced that you had crossed some invisible line between youth and maturity. It simply accumulated, like layers of paint on an old workshop bench. Each mark seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they told the entire story. Maybe that's why so many Gen X men struggle when someone asks them to describe themselves. Ask them who they are, and they rarely begin with personality. They begin with responsibility. I'm a father. I worked construction. I served. I've been with the same company 30 years. I take care of my mother. Notice the pattern. Their identity is often built around what they've carried, not what they've felt. To younger generations, this can seem unusual, even unhealthy. Modern culture encourages people to discover themselves by looking inward. Gen X men were often taught to discover themselves by looking at what needed doing. Neither approach is entirely right. Neither is entirely wrong, but they produce very different kinds of people. One searches for meaning through expression. The other finds meaning through contribution, and that difference explains so many misunderstandings. A quiet man is often mistaken for a man with nothing to say. An independent man is mistaken for someone who doesn't need anyone. A skeptical man is labeled negative. A reserved man is assumed to be emotionally distant. But here's where perception becomes deceptive. Many men like this aren't emotionally empty. They're emotionally disciplined. They learned, sometimes without realizing it, that reacting to every feeling could create more problems than it solved. So they developed another habit. Observe first, respond later. If you've ever watched an experienced mechanic diagnose an engine, you've seen this mindset in action. He listens. He watches. He narrows the possibilities. Only then does he act. Many Gen X men approach life the same way. Not because they're cold, because they've learned that most problems become clearer when emotion settles and observation takes its place. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as response inhibition, the ability to pause before acting on impulse. It's one of the core components of emotional regulation, and decades of research have linked it to better long-term decision-making, stronger relationships, and greater resilience under stress. But here's something fascinating. Most of these men never consciously trained this skill. Life trained it for them. When you're raising children, losing sleep, paying bills, caring for aging parents, or working 12-hour shifts, you don't always have the luxury of emotional immediacy. You learn that not every frustration deserves a reaction. That doesn't mean the feelings disappear. It means they no longer sit in the driver's seat. And over time, something remarkable happens. The world begins to feel a little less chaotic, not because it changed, because your internal world became steadier. You've probably known someone like this. During a family crisis, everyone else is panicking. He's making coffee, finding flashlights,
Calling the insurance company. Checking on the neighbors. People sometimes mistake his calm for indifference. In reality, it's often the opposite. He's focused because he cares.
He simply expresses concern through action rather than performance. But here's where it gets complicated. The same rule that creates resilience can also create silence. A man who has spent 40 years solving problems instead of discussing them may eventually stop mentioning the problems altogether. Not because he no longer feels overwhelmed, because carrying the weight quietly has become normal. He assumes everyone else is doing the same. Sometimes they are. Often they aren't. This is one of the hidden paradoxes of resilience. The stronger you appear, the less likely people are to ask whether you're struggling.
Competence becomes camouflage. Reliability becomes invisibility. The man who never complains slowly becomes the man nobody checks on. Not out of neglect, out of assumption. After all, he always seems fine. He's always been fine.
He'll figure it out. That's what he's always done. Yet beneath that dependable exterior, there can be an exhaustion that's difficult to explain. Not physical exhaustion, identity exhaustion. The quiet fatigue that comes from being known more for what you provide than for who you are.
And perhaps that's why so many men in their 50s and 60s find themselves asking questions they never had time to ask before. Who am I when no one needs me to fix something? What remains after the career ends?
What happens when the children no longer call for advice every week? Those questions aren't signs of weakness. They're signs that the role and the person are finally beginning to separate. And that separation can feel unsettling or liberating. It all depends on what comes next.